Choices. The choices we make follow us in life. You are free to choose. Choose any choice you want. But you're never free of the consequences. I'm Lot. You can read all about me, the beginning of my story, the beginning of the account of my life in Genesis chapter 14. You'll see in Genesis chapter 12, God, the living God, the one true God, the one who created heaven and earth, the one who promised to rescue mankind from their transgressions and their iniquities. God approached my uncle Abraham there in Ur of the Chaldees. Come out, he said. Come out from among the pagans. Come out from among the unbelievers. Come to a land that I will give you, a land I will show you and give to you and your descendants. And so Abraham and his wife Sarai, they left Ur of the Chaldees, and I decided to go with him. He was my uncle. My father was Haran, and Haran had died. And Abraham and Sarah had no children at all, and they kind of adopted me as their son. I traveled with Uncle Abraham all the way down to Egypt. We saw the wealth of the land, the power of Pharaoh, and after a period of time there in Egypt, we came back to the land that God would give to Abraham and his descendants, the land of Canaan. Together we worked, and we grew prosperous. The Lord blessed us, and blessed us richly, and God was always with us. Abraham's flocks, they grew, and he became powerful and wealthy and mighty. My flocks as well grew and became powerful, and I too began to enjoy all the blessings of wealth, all the trappings of riches. Finally, our flocks grew to be so great that they were interfering with each other. The helpers of Abraham and my helpers, they were beginning to feud and fight with one another. And finally, Uncle Abraham, he sat down with me and said, look, choose. If you choose to go left, I will go right. If you choose to go right, I will go left. You choose. And I looked at the land, and I looked down there at the plain of Sodom, and I saw that it was like the Garden of Eden itself, prosperous and wealthy and well-watered, and I chose to go down there. I should have given Abraham the first choice. He was the most generous. He was the elder. He deserved it. But out of his grace and goodness, he let me make that choice. Down to the cities of the plain I went. I pitched my tent down there and took along all my helper, all my hired men, and we set up camp down there outside the city there in the plains, and my flocks, they continued to grow and fatten, and I grew more and more wealthy by the day. And one day, other cities, the cities of the plain, they began to war and fight with one another, and there I was outside the city gates. Here come the armies. Battles ensue. We lost. And those of us who survived that battle, we were captured and taken off to be sold as slaves. The bottom rung of society. I had lost everything. My uncle Abraham, he heard about this, and he formed an army of 318 men, and they came and they attacked our captors. They overcame, they defeated them, and Abraham rescued me. I should have made the choice then and there to say, Uncle Abraham, can I live with you? Can I stay in your tents? Can I walk in the same godly path that you are walking? But no. I chose to go back to the city of Sodom, a city filled with wickedness, a city filled with sin, a city filled with ungodliness. I moved into the city of Sodom. I actually bought a house. If you look in the scriptures, you'll see that the word house is used for the very first time in the Bible in reference to me. I worked, I saved, I married, I had 2 daughters, and I once again became a prosperous man. So prosperous, in fact, that I was allowed to sit at the city gates. The city gates was an important place there within the city because it's there where individuals from the town, if they had an argument, a dispute, a lawsuit, they would come to those who sat at the city gates. They would present their case. We would hear their case. We would pass judgment, and then that judgment was enforced. I was considered a worthy man to sit there at the city gates, a worthy man dwelling in a wicked city. I made that choice. I made the choice of ignoring all the sin that was around me. I chose to close my eyes to the wickedness there in that city. I had rebuilt my wealth. I was living in comfort. My wife, my children, they were comfortable. But my choice affected them. The wickedness of the city had affected their hearts, their minds. They had to live, to grow, to dwell, surrounded by all that sin. I chose to do that. The wickedness of the city finally became so incredibly evil that God himself came down. My Uncle Abraham out there in the desert, in the plains, with his flocks, living in his tent, and one day he's sitting under the tree of Mamre. Read about it in Genesis chapter 18. God came with two of his angels, and they sat and visited with my Uncle Abraham. And as they were getting up to leave, God visited with Abraham and told him what he was going to do to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, all the cities of the plain. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, said God. He told Abraham, I am going down to see, and if their wickedness is as great as I have heard, I will destroy the city. To which my uncle Abraham prayed the first intercessory prayer found in the Bible, praying for someone else. Pray that if there are 50 righteous, what if there are 40 righteous? What if there are 30 righteous? Hey, what if there are 10 righteous people living in the city? Will you not spare the city for the sake of the 10? Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Said my uncle Abraham to God, and God in mercy, God in love, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy the city. God went back to paradise, and the two angels approached the city. There I was at the city gates, sitting in my position of authority, my position of honor, and I saw these two angelic beings, beautiful, bold, handsome, coming toward the city. I got up and I went to them and I said, come and stay with me. You don't want to spend the night in the middle of the city square, which was common in those days. Come and stay with me. Let me feed you, care for you, offer you safety. I knew what the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were like. I knew what they would do to these two handsome, beautiful men. I will protect you. I made that choice. I took them home. I fed them. During the night, the men of the city, all the men of the city came, started pounding on my door. Bring out the two men that are with you, that we may know them. They wanted to abuse them, to beat them, to rape them, ultimately to kill them. That's the city that I lived in. I went out, I told the crowds that were gathered at my door, don't do this wicked thing. This is horrible. This is wicked. Behold, I have two virgin daughters, daughters that have never known men. Let me give them to you, and you can do to them whatever you want. Can you imagine being so depraved in your mind that you're willing to offer your two beautiful daughters to a raging mob to kill them in a horrible way? You see, the choice that I had made had affected the way I thought, the way I lived, things that I would do. I myself was becoming depraved, saturated with the mentality of wickedness, to the point that I would give my daughters, my two beautiful daughters, to a mob filled with violence and lust and hate. The angels told me what we needed to do. Leave the city, they said. Take what you can with you and get out of town. But I hindered. I dilly-dallied. I stayed to the point where literally, finally, these two angels, they grabbed me by the hands and they dragged me out of the city. The very last thing they told me, do not look back. We fled. Me, my wife, my two daughters. As we were making our way to the hills, trying to find a cave for our protection from the calamity that was going to be rained down by God himself, suddenly we hear this massive explosion, and my wife, who was walking in front of me, she hesitated, she paused, and then she turned back. And when she turned back, she turned into a pillar of salt. Her heart was still in Sodom. The choice she made was to disobey the command of God, the command that would have given her life and hope and security. Instead, she was still in Sodom. And the consequences of her choice were death. With my daughters, we fled up to the hills. We found a cave and moved inside of this cave. Imagine that. Once again, I had lost everything. My home, my business, my prosperity, my life of comfort. Now I'm living in a cave like an animal with my two daughters. They had been engaged to two men in Sodom. I tried to get them to come out with us, but they thought I was joking. They stayed. And they died. And now my two daughters are without husbands, and in those days a woman had to be connected to a husband in some form or fashion for security, for blessings, for prosperity, primarily for children. And one night while we were eating our meager meal, they had a bottle of wine. They gave me too much wine, and I got really drunk and passed out, and they had sexual relations with me. The result of those sexual relations were the birth of two sons, one named Moab, who became the father of the Moabites, one named Ammon, who became the father of the Amorites, arch enemies of the nation of Israel. See what happens when we make choices without consulting God? Heartache, pain, chaos, murder, mayhem. You can make choices, any choice you want, but you cannot escape the consequences of those choices. You might be thinking to yourself that God is angry, that God showed his wrath, that God rained down wickedness and totally abandoned this entire situation, but I encourage you, read the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. According to the Old Testament, Ruth was a Moabite. In other words, a descendant of me. She could trace her lineage all the way back to that wicked time there in the cave with my two daughters. And yet, through God's grace, through God's power, Ruth the Moabite met Boaz. And Ruth and Boaz were married, and they had a little baby that they named Obed. And Obed grew up, and he married, and they had a little baby they named Jesse. And Jesse grew up and married, and he had a little boy named David. You know him as King David, greatest king of the nation of Israel, and an ancestor of none other than Christ himself. Read it in Matthew chapter 1. Choose. Choose life. Choose goodness. Choose godliness. Choose Christ.